The dog noticed her first. That was the thing nobody in the ward seemed to understand. The dog always noticed first. Before Sergeant Hale walked through the double doors with his jaw set and his eyes scanning every corner like he was still clearing a building in Fallujah, before the admitting nurse at the desk looked up from her computer and made the mistake of reaching toward him with a clipboard, before any of that, the dog had already read the room. Stood between his handler and the desk. Shoulders low, not threatening, just present, just saying, "I'm watching." His name was Kodiak. 94 pounds of Belgian Malinois, black-muzzled, amber-eyed, wearing a vest that said "Surface Dog" in reflective letters across both flanks. The paperwork was folded in the front pocket of Sergeant Hale's jacket. Documentation, certification, ADA compliance language that shouldn't have needed to exist but did because it always did. The sergeant's name was Brennan Hale, 41 years old, 14 years in the Army, including 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan that he never talked about. Medically retired 8 months ago after an IED removed part of his hearing in his left ear and most of his trust in enclosed spaces. He lived alone in a 2-bedroom apartment in Clarksville, Tennessee, kept the 2nd bedroom empty, and hadn't let anyone past his front door since his sister visited at Christmas, and left early because the silence was too heavy for her. He was here because his VA psychiatrist had called in a favor, because Riverside Behavioral Health had an open bed, because Brennan Hale had not slept more than 3 consecutive hours in 11 weeks, and his psychiatrist had finally used the word crisis out loud, and something about hearing it spoken in a clinical voice by someone he'd come to trust had made him pack a bag and drive 40 minutes south and walk through a set of double doors he'd been standing outside of for 20 minutes before he could make himself move. Kodiak moved with him. That was the arrangement. Margot Voss had been a nurse for 6 years, the last 2 of them on the behavioral health unit at Riverside. She was 31, originally from outside Columbus, Ohio, with a master's in psychiatric nursing and a habit of arriving 20 minutes before her shift started to read the intake notes in quiet. She kept a mug of tea at the nurse's station that was always cold by the time she drank it. She had short, dark hair she pinned back while working, and she wore the same pair of worn navy Danskos every shift because she'd once calculated she walked roughly 7 miles per shift, and she wasn't going to do that in anything that wasn't broken in. She was reading Brennan Hale's intake file when he arrived. She'd already flagged 3 things: the combat history, the severity of the sleep disruption, and the service animal. The service animal notation had a handwritten asterisk next to it, added by someone in admissions. See Hospital Policy REA. Animals in Psych unit, and that asterisk had made something tighten in Margot's chest the way wrong things always did. She'd set the file down, found the policy document, and read it twice. Then she'd gone to find her charge nurse. Karen Sproul had been running this unit for 11 years. She was 53 and efficient in the way that people who have had to fight for every protocol change they've ever implemented become efficient. Nothing wasted, no energy spent on battles that couldn't be won. She listened to Margot the way she always listened, standing still, arms crossed, face neutral. "I've looked at the policy," Margot said. "It doesn't actually exclude certified service animals from the unit. It says the charge nurse has final authority on a case-by-case basis, and his VA documentation is complete." I checked. Karen was quiet for a moment. "Dr. Pierce is the attending on that admit. I know. He's going to have thoughts. I know that too." Karen looked at her for a long moment. "Make sure the documentation is in the front of the chart," she said finally. Visible. That was as close to "I've got your back" as Karen Sproul ever got. And Margot knew it. Brennan Hale sat in the intake room and answered questions the way he'd been trained to answer questions. Directly, minimally, without volunteering information that wasn't requested. Name, rank, date of discharge. Current medications. Last psychiatric appointment. Sleep hours per night. The one that made the intake coordinator pause and write something down slowly. Kodiak sat beside his chair with his chin on Brennan's knee. The intake coordinator was a young man named Travis who was trying very hard not to look at the dog. He was doing okay at it. Brennan appreciated the effort. "So Kodiak is a certified psychiatric service animal," Travis said, checking the form. "Yes, and he's trained for nightmare interruption, hypervigilance grounding, crowd pressure, room-clearing behavior." Brennan said it without emotion, the way you recite things you've had to explain too many times. Travis typed. And you've been working together for 14 months. More typing. A pause. I do need to let you know that there's a conversation we'll need to have with the attending physician about the service animal on the unit. It's just a process thing. Nothing definitive yet. Brennan's jaw moved slightly, not quite clenching. He goes where I go. I understand. Like I said, it's a process. If he can't be on the unit, I'm not on the unit. He said it without heat, not a threat. A statement of logistics. The kind of sentence he'd learned to use because it was accurate and because it left no room for misinterpretation. Travis looked at his screen. Let me flag this for the charge nurse. Dr. Pierce arrived on the unit at 4:30, which was 45 minutes after Brennan had been shown to his room and 2 hours after Margot had flagged the service animal situation with Karen. He was 62, had practiced psychiatry for 30 years, and moved through the ward with the comfortable authority of someone who had never seriously questioned his own judgment and saw no reason to start. He read the chart at the nurse's station. He flipped past the VA documentation. He turned to Karen. The animal can't be on the unit. The patient's documentation is in order, Margot said. She was standing at the medication cart 3 feet away, not looking up from what she was doing. Pierce turned. He looked at her the way attending physicians sometimes look at nurses who speak without being addressed. Not hostile, exactly, but registering the breach. I'm sorry, his certification documentation is complete. ADA compliant. The hospital policy gives the charge nurse case-by-case authority on service animals in behavioral health. She did look up now. There's no regulatory basis for exclusion. The ward had gone quiet in the particular way wards go quiet, when something is happening that everyone is pretending not to watch. Pierce's voice was level. Psychiatric units have different considerations. They do, which is why this patient's psychiatrist specifically documented that separation from his service animal constitutes a clinical risk factor. It's on page 3 of his VA intake summary. He was quiet. A muscle moved near his jaw. I'll make the final call on this. Of course, Margot said. I just want to make sure the documentation is reflected in your decision. So the chart is complete either way. It wasn't a challenge, the way she said it. It was almost administrative. I'm making sure the paperwork is right. But everyone standing within 10 feet of the nurse's station knew exactly what she was doing, and some of them would think about it later, and a few of them would remember it when it mattered. Pierce looked at Karen. Karen looked at the wall behind him with professional neutrality. He picked up the chart again, read page 3, set it down. The animal stays, he said, as if it had been his idea. But I want behavioral documentation if there are any incidents. Absolutely, Margot said. I'll make a note. She knocked on Brennan's door at 6:15 during medication rounds. He was sitting in the chair by the window with the lights off, not because it was dark outside. It wasn't, not yet. But because the overhead fluorescence had been making the back of his eyes hurt since he got here, and the window light was enough. Kodiak was on the floor beside him. When Margot knocked and waited for the come in, the dog lifted his head and watched her cross the threshold the same way he watched everyone, reading speed, posture, intent. She handed Brennan his evening medications in a small plastic cup and a cup of water. He took them. She made a note on her tablet. Do you need anything for the room? She asked. Extra blanket, different pillow. The AC on this wing runs cold at night. I'm fine. She nodded. She was about to turn and leave when Kodiak made a sound. Not a bark, something softer. Like he was clearing his throat, she looked down at him. He was looking at her with those amber eyes, head slightly tilted. He does that, Brennan said. There was something in his voice that might have been almost apology, or might have been almost humor. Hard to tell. Both seemed a long way from his usual register. What does it mean? A pause. He's deciding about you. Margot crouched down, slowly, the way you move around animals that are working, no sudden gestures, body sideways, letting him decide. Is he allowed to greet if he wants to? She waited. Kodiak held her gaze for a moment. Then he stood up and walked to her and put his nose against her palm, one brief press, then turned and walked back to his spot beside Brennan's chair. That's something, she said. Yeah, another pause. It is. She stood up. I'll be on until 7 a.m. if you need anything. She left. In the hallway, she wrote on her tablet, patient calm, cooperative, essay present and settled, good baseline. Then she stood still for a moment, because there had been something in that room, not exactly sadness, or maybe exactly sadness, concentrated and careful, and she wanted to acknowledge it before she moved on. The first night was not good. She heard it from the hallway at 2:17 a.m., not screaming, not the sound she'd learned to brace for in behavioral health, something lower, breathing that had gone wrong. A rhythm that was too fast and too shallow and had been that way for long enough that it had weight. She knocked. She didn't wait long. She opened the door to find Brennan Hale sitting on the edge of his bed with his elbows on his knees and his head down, and Kodiak standing in front of him, both front paws on Brennan's thighs, applying pressure, pressing his forehead against Brennan's forehead. She stood just inside the doorway and didn't move toward them. This was the protocol she had developed on her own over 2 years through observation and error, and one conversation with a VA liaison nurse who'd come to do an in-service on trauma-informed care and said something that had lodged in Margot's brain like a splinter. Sometimes the only thing that helps is not interrupting what's already working. So she didn't interrupt. She stayed in the doorway. She made herself a presence, visible, quiet, not alarmed, and she waited. After a while, the breathing changed, slowed, steadied. Kodiak sat back down. He looked at Margot. Brennan lifted his head. He saw her in the doorway. Something moved across his face that she'd seen before on this unit, the particular shame of being witnessed in a moment you didn't choose. "I'm not going to document this as an incident," she said quietly. "This is exactly what he's supposed to do. It's working." He looked at her. "Do you want water, or I can just close the door?" A long silence, he said. She brought it. She sat in the chair near the window, not close to him, just at an angle where he wasn't alone but wasn't crowded. They didn't talk. After 20 minutes, he lay back down. Kodiak settled on the floor beside the bed. Margot made a note on her tablet. Patient experienced sleep disturbance, self-regulated with SA assistance, no clinical intervention required, and did her next medication check down the hall. The second day was when it went wrong. It started with shift change and a charge nurse she'd only worked with twice before, Terry Bascom, who covered when Karen had days off. Terry was not unkind, exactly. He was the kind of person who liked things legible, who got uncomfortable when situations had complexity that didn't fit into the boxes on a form. He'd seen Kodiak in the hallway during morning rounds and gone back to the nurse's station and pulled up the policy document himself. By 9 a.m., there was a conversation in the hallway that Margot wasn't part of between Terry and Dr. Pierce and one of the unit's social workers, a man named Gary, who Margot had always found difficult to read. She saw them from 30 feet away, saw the way the conversation had the tight geometry of people aligning, and something in her stomach dropped. She went to the break room and called the VA liaison line and asked for a name she'd written in her personal notes 4 months ago when she'd first started seeing more veterans on the unit. She left a message. She checked her email. She read for the third time the federal guidance on service animals in medical facilities. Dr. Pierce appeared in the break room doorway at 9:45. "We need to have a conversation about the service animal situation," he said. "Okay, the consensus on the team is that the dog is a disruption to the therapeutic environment. Other patients have raised concerns." "Which patients?" He paused. "I ask because if there are specific documented concerns from other patients, I want to make sure those are in the chart," she said. "For their records as well. This is a clinical decision." "Of course, I just want the basis for it documented." She kept her voice steady. She'd learned a long time ago that the most effective thing in this kind of moment was to sound like you were just doing paperwork. Because if we're overriding a federal accommodation on clinical grounds, that decision needs a clinical basis, specifically. In writing. The silence in the break room lasted long enough that she could hear the overhead fan. "I'm going to speak to the patient," Pierce said finally. "I'd like to be present." He looked at her. "As his nurse. It's my right to be present during clinical discussions that affect his care plan." He left without answering. She followed him down the hall. They went into Brennan Hale's room at 10 a.m. Brennan was sitting up in bed, Kodiak on the floor, both of them tracking the doorway the moment it opened. Margot watched Brennan read the room the way Travis had described in intake notes. Fast, thorough, not anxious, just prepared. He looked at Pierce. He looked at Gary the social worker. He looked at Margot. She held his gaze for a beat and gave him the smallest nod she could. "I'm here. I'm watching." She didn't know if he caught it. She thought he might have. Pierce introduced himself, which he hadn't done at admit. He explained the team's concern. He used clinical language, therapeutic environment, patient safety, protocol review, and he was careful and professional and said nothing that was technically a lie, which was the most insidious kind of wrongness. When he finished, Brennan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What's the specific concern?" "The presence of the animal on the unit. That's not specific." Pierce blinked. "What specific documented safety concern? From which specific patient?" Brennan's voice was flat in the way voices get when they've been through enough that the performance of deference no longer seems worth the energy. "Because I've been here 2 days. Kodiak has been on the unit 2 days. Nobody's talked to me about a problem. This is a clinical. You want to separate me from my service animal." "Not a question. On what documented grounds?" The room was quiet. It was Gary who spoke next. His voice had a conciliatory note that Margot recognized. The tone of someone who thinks they can make a difficult thing land softly if they just find the right angle. "We understand the attachment, Sergeant Hale, but we want to make sure we're approaching your care in the most therapeutic." "He's not an attachment." Brennan's voice didn't rise. "He's a medical accommodation. There's a difference. And you don't get to take a medical accommodation away because it's inconvenient." Margot wrote on her tablet. She made sure the sound of it was audible. Pierce looked at her. "What are you documenting?" "This conversation," she said, "as I said I would. He called a team meeting for 1 p.m. She knew what a team meeting called that fast meant. It meant someone had already decided something and needed the group to ratify it so the weight could be distributed. She called the VA liaison line again during her break, and this time someone answered. A woman named Constance, who had the precise, unhurried voice of someone who had heard every version of this story before. Margot explained the situation. Constance was quiet while she talked, and then she asked 3 questions, and then she said, "I'm going to send you a document. It's the federal guidance, specifically on service animals in inpatient psychiatric settings. Can you print it before 1 p.m.? "Yes. Print 2 copies. Margot printed 2 copies. The team meeting was in the small conference room off the nurses' station. Pierce, Gary, Terry Bascom, and 2 nurses who'd been on the day shift since the unit opened were already there when Margot arrived. She sat down. She put the 2 printed documents face down on the table in front of her. Pierce opened with a summary that characterized the situation as a safety matter. Gary provided context about the therapeutic community model of the unit and the importance of consistency for all patients. Terry nodded at appropriate intervals. The 2 day shift nurses looked at their hands. Margot waited until they were done. Then she turned the first document over and slid it to the center of the table. "This is the federal guidance on service animals in inpatient psychiatric settings," she said. Section 4, Paragraph 2 specifically addresses certified psychiatric service animals and states that documented clinical risk, defined as risk to the patient of removing the accommodation, must be weighed against any unit safety concern, and that clinical risk takes precedence when properly documented. She slid the second copy toward Pierce. His VA records include exactly that documentation. No one spoke. "I also want to note," she said, "that as of this morning, I've been unable to find a single documented complaint from another patient about Kodiak's presence on the unit. If that documentation exists, I'd like to see it. Because if it doesn't exist, then the basis for this team meeting isn't a safety concern. It's a preference." Pierce's face had done something Margot recognized, gone past irritation into something quieter and more dangerous. "You're out of line, Voss." "I'm doing my job," she said, "which is patient advocacy. That's in the nursing charter. It's in our unit mission statement. It's on the laminated card on the wall outside this room." She paused. "I'm not trying to make this adversarial. I'm asking us to make sure our decision is grounded in documented evidence. Because if it isn't, and if it goes wrong, this unit is exposed. And Sergeant Hale is harmed." Another silence. It was Terry who broke it. He said, slowly, like he was working it out while he spoke, "If there are no documented patient complaints, then we don't have a safety case." Nobody answered him. But the shape of the room shifted. Pierce stood. "I'll review the documentation," he said. "Not you were right. Not I'll change my recommendation. Just, I'll review the documentation." Which was enough. The meeting ended. In the hallway afterward, Karen Sproul, who had not been in the meeting, fell into step beside Margot without saying anything for a moment. Then she said, "How'd it go?" "He's going to review the documentation." Karen nodded once. Good, she said, and turned down the corridor toward the main desk. Margot didn't tell Brennan Hale what had happened in the meeting. That wasn't her role, and she was careful about her role because she'd seen what happened to nurses who blurred it, who took on the emotional labor of the conflict, who made themselves the protagonist instead of the advocate, who turned their patients' crises into their own narrative. She didn't want to be that nurse. What she did was knock on his door at 3 p.m. during afternoon rounds and tell him that the service animal situation had been reviewed and Kodiak was cleared to remain on the unit for the duration of his stay. Brennan looked at her. A long look, the kind where the assessment is more thorough than it appears. Kodiak, from his spot on the floor, also looked at her. That was fast, Brennan said. The documentation was pretty clear. Another pause. Was there a fight? She considered the question honestly. A conversation, she said. A documentation issue. It's resolved. He was quiet. Then, slowly, like the words were heavier than they should have been for how simple they were. Thank you. It's my job, she said. No, he said. It isn't. She didn't argue with him because he was right, and they both knew it. He stayed for 11 days. She wasn't there for all of them. She had 2 days off midway through, and on her first day back, she checked his chart before she changed into her work shoes and saw that the night nurse had noted improved sleep duration. First 5 hours and then on the 9th night, 6. She read that twice. During the days she was there, she developed a routine with him that she'd never had with a patient before. Not warmer than professional, exactly, but with a kind of calibrated distance. She'd learned in 2 years on this unit that what some patients needed wasn't closeness. It was consistency. The same knock, the same timing, the same voice. The predictability itself was therapeutic. She brought him his medications. She asked if he needed anything. She answered his questions directly and without softening when softening wasn't warranted, and she did not talk to him like he was fragile, because he wasn't. He was wounded, which was different. She had learned that distinction from a nurse she'd worked under in her first year, a woman who'd said, "Fragile things break, wounded things heal. Don't confuse them, or you'll treat them the same and you shouldn't." Kodiak stopped making his assessment sound every time she came into the room after the 3rd day. He started settling back down when she left, which was, she'd checked this, because she was the kind of person who checked things, a sign of behavioral acceptance. She mentioned it to Brennan on the 5th day, not as a clinical note, but because she thought he'd want to know. "Yeah," he said. "I know. He has good instincts, better than mine." And then, after a pause, "Used to be, anyway." He was looking at the window. The afternoon light was doing something particular, coming in low and gold. Takes a while to trust that they still are. She thought about that for the rest of the shift. On the 10th day, there was a group session in the unit's common room. Brennan didn't have to attend. The attending didn't push him. But at 10:15, when Margot was passing the common room door, she saw him inside, sitting in a chair near the back wall, and Kodiak was sitting beside him, and 2 other patients were petting the dog. One of them laughing at something, the easy, brief laugh of someone who'd forgotten, just for a second, to be wherever they were. She kept walking. She didn't make it a moment, but she wrote it in her notes because she wrote everything. Patient participated in group session, voluntary. Essay integrated without incident. Positive patient interaction observed. On the 11th day, he was discharged. He came to the nurse's station before he left. He had his bag over one shoulder and Kodiak on his left, vest on, the 2 of them moving with the economy of people who have been somewhere long enough to know where everything is and are now leaving. He set an envelope on the counter. "It's a card," he said, before she could ask. "For the staff. I'm not good at." He stopped. Started again. "I wanted to do something." Margot picked up the envelope. "I'll make sure everyone sees it." He nodded. He was about to turn when he stopped, and he looked at her in that way he had, direct, assessing, not unkind. "I looked up what you did," he said, "with the service animal. I know it wasn't just a documentation thing." She was quiet. "I don't know why you went to the trouble." She thought about how to answer that. She thought about the real answer, which was complicated and had to do with a conversation with a VA liaison nurse 4 months ago and a laminated mission statement on a wall and 2 years of watching the difference between what the paperwork said and what people actually did. She thought about the simpler answer, which was also true. "Because it was right," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "Yeah, Like she'd confirmed something he'd already decided. That's what I figured. He turned and walked toward the exit. Kodiak paced beside him, vest straight, chin level, working. At the double doors, Brennan hit the release bar and they slid open, and for a second they were framed there. Soldier and dog, late morning light behind them, the particular stillness of people who have decided to keep going. Then they were gone. Margot stood at the nurse's station for a moment. She picked up her cold tea and drank it anyway, and went back to work. 3 weeks later, Karen Sproul called her into the office. There was a letter from the VA regional office on the desk, a formal request to review the unit's policy on certified psychiatric service animals in inpatient settings, citing Riverside Behavioral Health as a case study. Karen had already read it twice. They want us to help them write the new guidance, Karen said. Margot sat down across from her. Okay, that means putting your name on it, I know. Karen looked at her steadily. Pierce isn't going to love that. No, Margot paused, but it's right. Karen was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and slid the letter across the desk. Then let's get started, she said.